Henry, Eliane, nice to see you. Adele, Phil, nice to see you. Good morning. Everyone is bright and early this morning. I feel a bit bright and early. We're 2 hours earlier than you. I had to go to an earlier tefillah this morning in order to make this time slot. But there's no reason why we can't continue learning even under these circumstances. We are, as is the shiurim that we're going through at the moment, I've entitled Themes in Sefer Bereshis. And one of the most profound themes in Sefer Bereshis is the whole issue of Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, and the issue of the Eitz Hadas and what exactly happened there. What happened in Gan Eden? What happened with Adam and Chava? Why were they there? Why were they thrown out? And of course, the whole of human history as we know it only happens after they are evicted from Gan Eden. But the Torah obviously gives us this story for a reason. Let me just talk about this big picture just for a couple of minutes. When the Torah gives us, it's a very fascinating big picture theme, which is worth paying some attention to. The Torah very often describes for us a totally ideal, blissful existence, which is then lost, subsequently lost, and then it has to be recaptured through our efforts. This is a very fascinating theme in the Torah, and the truth is, it's an interesting theme in human psychology and in human life as well, that you often have an initial idea, like somebody wants to build a building or build a machine, and it has an initial brainwave and a theory, and he makes a map for it, and he describes it in its absolutely ideal terms. He's building a palace, and that stage of the process in the ideal world is a very important stage. It's a stage at which all the foundations the map is made. However, afterwards, it takes years of very hard work to actually make that happen. In other words, to transform the theory into the practice is a different stage completely. And in a similar way, maybe I've oversimplified it, of course, quite a lot, but the Mepharshim speak about the idea. The Torah wants to give us the idea Adam and Chava begin their life in Gan Eden, right? And in an idyllic, blissful world. And then they're thrown out and they've got to work. They have to get to work and work on themselves, work on the world. But interestingly, the goal is in some way to get back in again. In other words, once you get the descriptions, for example, in Zechariah and in Yeshaya Hanavi about the Yemos HaMashiach, about the redeemed world is a little bit of a Gan Eden type world. It's an ideal world. So in other words, the Torah gives us this very fascinating image. I'm talking about a big picture, as big as you could possibly get, where mankind begins in a blissful, perfect existence and ends in a blissful, perfect existence. And in the middle, there's just a lot of work to be done and a lot of ups and downs. But there is a pure beginning and a pure end. And this is a very fascinating theme, which we find for the first time in Gan Eden with Adam and Chava. They're in this pure, perfect existence, and then they mess it up, they leave, but then they spend the rest of history trying to recapture that existence. And indeed, the Ramban, in one or two places in his commentary on the Torah, describes the image, the messianic image, the idea of a redeemed world. He describes it as returning to Adam Harishon Lifnei Hachet. That's his phrase. The phrase of the Ramban is that ultimately mankind will return to Adam Harishon Lifnei Hachet, living in a world of complete spiritual and physical harmony with each other, harmony with nature, and of course, ultimately harmony with God. It's actually interesting. I've mentioned to you before that one of the reasons I'm teaching this particular course on themes in Sefer Bereshis is because in Bereshis is the template, if you like, the map of many things that happen later on in the Chumash. And one of the interesting ones, I just want to compare this for one moment, is Matan Torah. That Matan Torah in the Chumash, think about this for a second, ladies and gentlemen. Matan Torah in the Chumash happens twice, right? There's the first luchos, which are then smashed, and then there are the second luchos. And this is also a very, very interesting, I'm talking big picture here without going into the details, but the first moment at Har Sinai, right, was a completely pure spiritual moment where every man and woman in Klal Yisrael directly and personally could hear the voice of God, right? And the Gemara describes it as a moment where their neshamas and their life was absolutely pure. And in fact, the Gemara relates it to a return to Adam Harishon Lifnei Hachet. This idea of Adam Harishon before having sinned is an extremely important, if you like, restart point. You know, we all have learned at some stage in our life to use these wretched computers, but you do know if things start going wrong, what are you supposed to do? The answer is you press restart. You shut it down and switch it on again. That is the restart button. Okay, so the Torah also has, but you can only have a restart button if in the beginning when you switched it on, everything was functioning properly. If everything was completely okay, then later on when things start crashing, so you know what, we're going to do a restart. And according to my IT advisor, there's something even more radical than a restart, and that's a factory reset. You can actually get the whole wretched thing reset to the way it was manufactured in the first place. So that is a very interesting model for learning Bereshis chapter 3, which is the way in which man and woman were really created in an absolutely perfect way, exactly as the designer and the manufacturer, the Rebbeinu Shalom, wanted. And then later on, things started crashing. You got software in which didn't work properly. Inadvertently, you downloaded a bit of malware of one sort or another, and then you need to be able to reset, right? At Matan Torah, there was a reset. At Matan Torah, Klal Yisrael had a chance to go back to that idyllic stage of pure relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That was the Anochi Hashem Elokecha, right? And that lasted not very long, right? It lasted only until, and I'm mentioning this particularly because we just had Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. On Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, Nishtabru Haluchas. Shiva Asar B'Tammuz was the day on which Moshe Rabbeinu comes down 40 days later and smashes the luchos. And that's it. That's the end of the Gan Eden state of being, right? And then they had to work hard. And then they had to work hard. They had to do tshuva. They had to build the Mishkan. They had to do a lot. And then they eventually got the second luchos. And the second luchos is the Torah and mitzvahs that we work on. And the goal is to try and create an initial ideal situation. There is a very beautiful Gemara actually in Yuma which says that luchos v'shivrei luchos munachim ba'orein. That's what the Gemara says. And in the Aron HaKodesh was not only the luchos that Moshe Rabbeinu brought down the second time, but also the shivrei luchos. What's a good word for the shivrei luchos, or the
shards?
What do you say?
Shards.
Yes, shards. Yes, the broken fragments. Right, the broken fragments, the shivrei luchos of the first luchos were also munachim ba'orei. They also were in the Aron HaKodesh. So in other words, the first Matan Torah was not meant to be completely forgotten. It was vital to establish a restart point, right? An ideal point where the Jewish people were living in an idyllic state, to preserve that in the Aron HaKodesh in order that we can one day recapture it. And that's one of the very fascinating ideas, which has its root in Odom Harishon, in Gan Eden, and the chapter that we are learning together at the moment. I once heard actually one Rabbi Tatz, some of you might know Rabbi Tatz in London, who is really a star speaker. And the way he describes things, he always finds wonderful, Rabbi Tatz always finds wonderful examples from our everyday experience to illustrate his point. And he was once talking about this point, and he said something very interesting. He said that in a relationship between a chassan and kala, we find exactly the same thing happening, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us a certain initial flash of falling in love, right? Where at the moment that the young couple meet each other and they see each other and they have a flash of completely what turns out to be really unrealistic view of each other, that everything is fabulous and fantastic and blissful and flawless, and everything is going to be absolutely amazing, and that lasts for however long it lasts for, either for 5 minutes or for 5 weeks or for 5 months, whatever it is, right? And then the rest of his life and her life is not like that anymore. We're not in love. If we were in love all our life with our husband and wife, we would not be able to function at all. We wouldn't be able to function. That was meant to be a sort of a blast of inspiration, pure inspiration, which was meant to give us a sort of a flashed picture of what it could be like. And then the picture goes away, and then you've got to do the work. You've got to work it through to recreate it in the real world using our choices and our relationship to recreate it. But it's an interesting idea that this mechanism of starting with a flashed idea of the ideal and then losing it in order to recapture it later exists really in human psychology as well. But in the Torah, we find it both in Odom and Chava and in Matan Torah. What's interesting about this theory that I'm giving you at the moment is that if this is correct, then it could be, now listen to this, it could be that actually Odom and Chava in Gan Eden from the very beginning was a state of existence that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, knew was not sustainable. It wasn't meant to be sustainable. Mankind was not meant to live in Gan Eden eternally. It was meant to be a sort of an introduction to what life could be like, and then leave here and go and see whether you can recreate it out of your own initiative. And the same thing, it could be that the first Matan Torah, the first level of Ruchnius that they achieved at Har Sinai, was also in some way unsustainable. What does it mean unsustainable? That given the nature of the human being and human choices and human desires, etc., this was not something which could be sustained for very long. But it was meant to give us an initial burst of Ruchnius in order that later on, when we recapture it, we're not inventing something new, we're recapturing something which existed beforehand. I saw in one of the Mefarshim an interesting, so what I'm trying to explain to you is this idea existed both in Gan Eden and at Har Sinai, and there's one other place in Chazal, not in the Tanakh, but in Chazal, where the same idea is made use of, which I'd just like to mention to you in this connection, which I find very fascinating. And that is the Gemara in Nida, which I'm sure many of you have heard before, which is that Chazal say that the baby in the uterus learns the whole of Torah. The whole of Torah, right? All of us, we've learned the entire Torah, everything there is to be learned. We learned it when we were in the uterus, and then at birth, we get silenced, and we forget it, right? And what's the point of that? Why do that? So I think Rav Dessler says that that's similar to this idea we've just been talking about, And in order basically that all the learning Torah we do later in our life, we are just in some deep sense remembering. We're recalling ideas that we already knew at some deeper level. We knew this, and we can, and therefore it's easier for us to learn Torah in our life if at some deep level, deep in the mind, at some deep subconscious level, we've heard it before. We've heard these ideas before, we can recapture them later on. So that's what's happening with Adam and Chava. Because mankind had been in Gan Eden before, later in life we can recapture parts of it. And I find that's a very fascinating idea. Funnily enough, Lahavdil Elef Havdalas, in the writings of Plato, you find a similar idea. He said that Plato writes that all learning is remembering. At some deeper level, when you're learning a new idea and the idea suddenly makes sense to you, when an idea makes sense, it's because you've heard it before and you know that it's right intuitively, because somewhere Plato also believed that the soul comes into the world with fully equipped, with preloaded software, right? Only it needs to be activated. Activate the learning is to activate software which has been preloaded into the soul before you were born. So writes Plato 2,500 years ago, and some of the ideas that he writes about, when I read them for the first time, I thought, wow. I remember learning this piece of Plato in university and thinking, wow, that's the Gemara in Nida, which says we've learned everything before birth, and then later on when we learn, we only remember it. So it's interesting to join the dots sometimes and see similarities over different disciplines and different authors. I find that particularly interesting. Anyway, why am I mentioning all this? Because we are now learning, I'd like to now have a look at some text. We're learning some of these very, very foundational ideas. Bereshis is about foundational ideas of human psychology and of the destiny of mankind. And in it, we find that yes, somebody has texted me saying that there is also in the more Kabbalistic ideas, which I don't usually delve into at all, certainly not in these shiurim, there is this idea that God created a perfect world, and then there was a moment of shvirat hakelim. That's what the Arizal uses, the phrase, shvirat hakelim. The world was shattered by various averos, and then the process of mankind is tikkun olam, tikkun in the sense of mending that which was broken. But in order to mend something that was broken, it had to be at some stage perfect. It had to be a perfect vessel, then it got broken, and then we're mending it. So this is really, when you're learning Bereshis and Adam and Chava, you're learning about what the world looked like before Shvirat HaKelim, before the world was spiritually smashed. And then for the rest of mankind, we are trying to climb back and recapture that moment in Gan Eden. So this is I think it's a very profound philosophical and spiritual study of these stories. And sadly, the story of Adam and Chava is, first of all, it's rarely taught. In school, teachers tend, I know in school, my Chumash teacher started Chumash from Lech Lecha, and never ever taught us Bereshis and Noach. We started in Lech Lecha, right? Maybe he didn't particularly want to teach 6-7-year-olds the story of Adam and Eve walking around naked in Gan Eden and doing Averis. So he started in Lech Lecha with Avram Avinu. And the truth is, Jewish history begins with Avram Avinu. It's quite true. But the Torah, Bereshis and Noach, really deals with foundational issues which predated the Avram and Jewish history. And in that way, it's very, very fascinating. So last time, at the end of the share last week, we were looking at Bereshis chapter 3, and we were looking at the appearance of the snake. The snake is a very interesting moment in the Chumash. Adam and Chava are living this blissful existence in Gan Eden, and they've been told, Mikol eitz hagan ochel teichal, you can eat from wherever you like. The entire world is yours. Every single tree and plant in the world is for you to eat and to enjoy. But just the eitz hadas, tovara, that tree you shouldn't eat. And they assumed that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who wanted only their best interests, that eating from the eitz hadas will damage them, will be bad for them. So they're like being told, look, you can eat this and this and this, but that is poisonous. Don't eat from it because it's poisonous. That's what they sort of assumed. Comes along the Nachash and says to them, no, it's not poisonous. On the contrary, if you eat from this eitz hadas, it'll make you not only powerful, it'll make you too powerful. And God doesn't want you to be too powerful. And let's have a look at this inside just for a moment, see if we can find the screen. Right. See a screen? Ellie? Yeah? Good, thank you. Okay, so just to review this is where we finished off last week. The serpent, the snake, was the most arum. Arum here he translates as shrewd, meaning cunning or devious from all the other animals. So the Nachash is equipped with the best, the highest qualities of animal kingdom, but he's not equipped with a neshama. He's not equipped with any moral knowledge. He represents the power of the animal kingdom. Vayomer Isha, and he communicates with the woman. And we discussed last week, how do we learn this idea of him communicating with the woman? But let's just have a look for a second. He says, Afki Omar Elokim lo tochlu mikol eitz hagan. Didn't God say to you, you can't eat from any of the trees in the Gan? Now, clearly, this is not true. They were told they can eat from all the trees in the Gan except for one. But the Nachash, very cleverly, in order to engage her in conversation, says something which she has to reply to, right? The Rasha, the main thing he wants is to engage you in conversation, right? So he first says to you, obviously, somebody comes to you and says, obviously, all the mitzvahs of the Torah are designed that you should never have any pleasure from life at all. Basically, that's what the Nachash says, right? To which, of course, any observant Jew will say, what do you mean we haven't got any pleasure from life as well? There's Shabbos, there's Yom Tov, there are all the Hanos. But the point of this opening line is that she should engage in conversation with him. So he says something outrageously wrong, right? Didn't God really say you should not eat from any tree of the garden? The truth is, the very, very first commandment that Adam and Chava got before they were even told not to eat from the eitz hadas, the first commandment was, we saw it. They were told, Mikol eitz hagan ochal tocha. You eat from everything. It's all at your disposal. Eat from everything. So the snake is coming in a very seductive way, in a very shrewd and seductive way. He wants to get her to converse. So I showed you just briefly last week, we ended up with this, that the Sforno, for example, says, V'hanochosh hu hasoton hu yetzer hara. That the Nachash is not meant to be taken literally, that there is a snake, a talking snake in Gan Eden. A talking snake, right, in our minds, a talking snake is if you like, a cartoon image. Unless the Torah tells us that this is a nace, that there was a miracle, right? You could say there was a talking snake, right? There are three options here about the snake. Either what the Sforno says, that the Nachash is the Yetzer Hara, it's a voice in Chava's head telling her to do something wrong. That's the Sforno's pshat. Or you can say that in the world of Gan Eden, nature was so different to the nature that we are familiar with, that even the snakes were able to communicate, the animals were able to communicate with human beings, and human beings understood the language of the animals. that in some way that he could communicate, or you can say that really this was a miracle, a bit like we just had, didn't we, in last week's parsha, the talking donkey of Bilam. So maybe there was a talking snake with Chava. So these are three options, and all three of them you will find among the Mefarshim. All these three options are mentioned. The truth is, for the message of the story, it doesn't really matter whether the Nachash is actually a talking snake or it's a metaphor. For some reason, in Klal Yisrael, I have found, I just want to mention this to you, which I find a little bit humorous sometimes. I have found that some audiences that I teach to sort of intuitively prefer to understand all these things to be metaphorical, right? Like, of course, it's a metaphor. There are no talking snakes around. It's a metaphor. The Torah is not asking us to believe in a Donald Duck world, basically, right? But it's just not like that. So that, I think many of us react like that. Equally, I must tell you, there are some audiences that I've spoken to that when I say, well, it's true, the Pasuk says this, but it's not meant to be taken literally, it's a metaphor, they go crazy. How can you say, chas v'shalom, that it's a metaphor, it's meant to be literal, you must never say the Torah is speaking metaphorically, it says what it means, and it means what it says. And occasionally I've got into trouble on this, trying to teach, I think I might have mentioned to you once, a class that I gave in Manchester. Phil, maybe you will recall life in Manchester, right? In Manchester, there are one or two communities in Manchester that are very, how shall I put it, in the deep into the Haredi mindset, right? And it was a few weeks before Purim, and the topic about, so they asked me to give a tearaway shiur on a Sunday morning, and there were about 100 people there, and I chose a topic: did Vashti have a tail? That was the name of my topic, right? Because there's a well-known medrash that Vashti had a tail, grew a tail, right? And that's why she didn't come before Achashverosh, because she grew a tail. Did Vashti have a tail? So, of course, to believe that Vashti grew a tail is, again, to believe in a sort of a miraculous, unreal, what in my mind I think of as a bit of a cartoon type of a description. So I brought them 3 or 4 classic Mefarshim, including the Maharal and the Maharsha and Rav Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin. I brought them at the text, actually. I gave them a printed text, all of whom explained this metaphorically. And of course, there was no tail. The tail is a metaphor for something. Whatever it is, it's a metaphor. They were very upset with me. That shiur, they got very upset. What do you mean? What do you mean? It's a metaphor. It doesn't make, how can you say that? We always taught that everything the Chazal say is perfect. We've all been to kindergarten and drawn pictures of Vashti with a tail. It must be true. Okay, so you know what? That is a mindset that is just not willing to let go of the literal translation of words. But actually, and the people who do feel that way believe when they're doing that this is a particularly high level of religiosity to insist on the literal translation of the words. The truth is that I think it's doing Chazal and doing the Torah an injustice, because the Torah is much more subtle and much deeper than that. The Torah is giving us subtle messages and deeper messages. And when we say that something is a metaphor, this is not, we're not saying it's not true. We're saying, on the contrary, it is true, but it's true on some sort of symbolic level. But then the question is, what's it a symbol of? Right? So the Maral, for example, has got a whole piece on how the tail of Vashti is symbolized in the idea that she represented the tail end of the power of Nebuchadnezzar. She was like the 3rd or 4th generation after Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had been endowed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu with a certain power to do evil in the world, destroy the Beis HaMikdash and all sorts of things. But she was the tail end of it. She was the great-granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and she was the very, very, this event with Vashti and Achashverosh and her being executed by the king, that was the tail. That was what we say the tail end. We use this metaphor in English as well. When you speak about a tail end of something, you don't mean it's grown a tail. You mean that's the end of a process. That's the end of an era. That's how the Maharal learns it. They did not like not the Maharal and not the Maharshal and not Rav Tzadok Cohen from Lublin. They got very, very, very upset with me. So much so, in fact, that all these shiurim, many of these shiurim take place, are taped and archived and available online. For some reason, the manager of the shiur told me afterwards that something had gone wrong with the taping and they hadn't managed to tape my shiur, and therefore it wouldn't be going up on the archive. So I found that a little bit humorous, and Baruch Hashem, I didn't live in that town. I was just there as a guest, but I just found it very fascinating that different communities have different sensitivities when it comes to how to learn Chumash. I guarantee you that Gedolei Yisrael, like the Maharal and the Maharshal particularly, two of the greatest minds of explaining Midrash Chazal, time and time again, speak about the way in which we have to very often understand the words of the Torah to be symbolic rather than literal. The Rambam, of course, has got a whole essay on this subject of people who think that the words of Chazal are literal. He says are childish and have never even begun to understand what Talmud Torah is all about. So this is a major theme, and this example here that we have is a classic example of that. And here is the Sforno, for example, going down that route, saying there was no talking snake in Gan Eden. The Nachash represents the Soton Hu HaYetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara is a voice inside everybody's head. Rav HaHezek, right? Rav HaChazak, which means it's got a lot of power, right? A snake has got a lot of power. A snake can be fatal. Imiyut Hayosa Nire, but he can't be seen. A snake sort of slips between the grass, bites you, and disappears again. In other words, you can't really grab it. You can't grasp it. It's very hard, right? And that's why we find that lots of times something is described using a metaphor of something which is similar to it. We'll sometimes speak about a king as being a king like a lion, right? We don't mean that he's suddenly a lion. We mean that he's got that power and that abilities. Okay. So he says, Valderech, Valzeh Haderech, we haven't learned this yet. Valzeh Haderech, Kora Bezeh HaMokim, in this place, Bezeh HaMokim, in this place in the Chumash, the Torah refers as a Yetzer Hara to the voice inside the human mind, which wants the person to do something which is wrong. This voice is called Hamachati. This is the voice which is Machati, which wants a person to go wrong. He calls it a Nachash. Right? That is simply a symbolic word. Because it's comparable to the snake in certain ways. Because the benefits that a snake gives in nature is very little. V'nizko rav, but the damage it does can be massive. Imiyut heroso, and he's difficult to see and difficult to catch. And he's found a reference in the Medrash that refers to this Nachash as Samael, Samach Mem Aleph Lamed, which is one of the words used in Chazal for the Soton, for the power of evil. This is not a demonic power of evil, sort of flying around like Batman, but it's a voice of destructiveness which is built into the human body. Rochev Olov, v'husha koach hamis'aveh. So he says it's mainly identified with the human koach hamit'aveh, the strong personal desires of a person, hamachati, which wants to cause him to do a chait. And he does it using, and this is what I'm going to come to in one moment. This is giving me a bit of an introduction to the pasuk I want to look at in a moment, using the koach hamadame. What is the koach hamadame? Anybody know what the koach hamadame is? Medame, mem dalad mem hey. So he goes on to explain it a little bit. Hamochil elov dimyone ta'anugim achomrim. The Yetzer Hara has as its disposal, its most important weapon is what we would call today fantasy, imagined pleasures, which aren't even real, which aren't real at all. But when you're in the middle of the fantasy gets you to imagine that this will be the greatest pleasure in the world. And these fantasies, says the Masforno, hamati miderech hashleimus hamachuvim meis hakelis barach, will turn a person away from the route, the derech, towards his own personal shleimus, which is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants him to do. We'll come back to this in a minute. Let's go back to the dialogue. So the woman responds to the Nachash, what do you mean we're not allowed to eat anything from the garden? Of course we're allowed to eat from everything in this garden, right? Imagine Gan Eden was stretched before them with trees and fruit until the horizon of the entire world. The entire world had been created by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There were no other human beings around. And everything was at their disposal. We can eat from anything. Only, says the woman to the Nachash, but there's one tree in the middle, about which HaKadosh Baruch Hu said you shouldn't eat of it, v'lo tig'u, and not to touch it. Pentu musun, because it will kill you. What is weird about this statement of the woman? What does it mean? Lo tochel, it's true she was told lo tochel, but what is this phrase here? Below sig ubo, and don't touch it. Had HaKadosh Baruch Hu told them not to touch it? There is no pasuk telling them not to touch it, right? So Rashi immediately picks this up and introduces us to a very complicated subject. There's a very complicated subject here. That Chava clearly believed that not only was she not to eat from the tree, she shouldn't even touch it. It was, to make use of the terminology of Chazal, the tree was muktzah. It was 24/7, it was muktzah. Do not touch it. Says Rashi, look at this amazing Rashi. Rashi says, look at this. Below Sigubo, Hosifo al Hatzivui. She added to God's commandment. As God just simply commanded them, don't eat from it. And she added to it, don't touch it. Possibly, that it wasn't her addition, it was probably the addition of Odom. The Mefarshim here explained this Rashi, this pasuk, that probably it was Odom who was told by God not to eat from it. And he, when he told his wife, he said, you know what, don't eat from it. God said, don't eat from it. And God also said, don't touch it, which wasn't true. That wasn't true. Says the Rashi, Hosifa ala tzivui, lefikach, and therefore, ba'ar lidei gira'on. Because she added to it, she came afterwards to subtract from it. In other words, when you add to something, it's a very interesting principle, this. If something, let's just have a look how Rashi ends up. Husha Omar al tosef al devorov. Don't add to the words of God. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has said something, we shouldn't add to it. If you add to it, I think if you like, conceptually, the principle behind this is that if a masterpiece is perfect, you can ruin it by adding, just like you can ruin it by subtracting from it. If as it is, it's Torah Hashem Tamima, Meshivas Nofesh. If the Torah is perfect, then clearly you mustn't subtract to it, but there's also an Isur to add to it, right? What is the problem with that? Why is this a big problem, Rabbi Say, ladies and gentlemen? Why is this a big problem? Is because in the halacha we have endless examples where Chazal came and added Isurim to the Torah, right? The Torah gives us, The Torah gives us an Isur, let's say on Shabbos, not to write with a pen. And the Chazal said, don't even touch the pen. All the Isuri Muktzah of Shabbos seem to be exactly what Rashi tells us here is a problem. So this is actually quite an interesting theme, which has been written a lot about in Chazal, and the Rambam's got a whole piece on this as well. The importance of knowing what is really forbidden min ha-Torah and what is really added on by the Chachamim. This is a very, very interesting theme. Lots and lots, an enormous amount. I hesitate to give a percentage, but certainly a large percentage of our Jewish practices, right? A large percentage of our Jewish practices are what we call midrabanan, of rabbinic origin, right? Not of not min ha-Torah. And yet this seems to be going against what Rashi's saying here. Rashi's saying that one of the reasons for the mistake of Chava, one of the reasons for her fall, was because she exaggerated the Isur. Now, somebody here has just texted me, quite rightly, I was coming to that in a minute, Michael, that there is a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos in the very, very beginning of Pirkei Avos, right? That where the Mishnah says that Heva Mesunim Badin, V'ha'amidu Talmidim Harbe, V'asu Siyog La Torah. That the Chachamim were empowered by the Torah to make a siyag. A siyag is another word for a geder, to make a fence around the Torah. And the Chachamim were charged by the Torah not only to teach Torah, but actually to employ the principle of Isurei D'Rabbanan and Mitzvahs D'Rabbanan. Simple examples, I don't know, everybody here in this year makes before you go to the meal on Shabbos, before you eat bread, you make Natilas Yadayim. That is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. That's a mitzvah of rabbinic origin. And it's got to do with certain attitudes towards food and to sanctify one's hands before eating food, in some way to raise the spiritual level of what is fundamentally a physical activity. Eating is an animalistic activity, which is essential for our existence, obviously, but at the same time, it has the power to trigger off in us the animal side of the human mind. So we make the tilas yadayim and a bracha beforehand in order to, in some way, reframe the whole activity of eating. We don't eat just stuff the food in. We do it in a way which shows that we're not doing it animalistically. We're doing it for kedusha purposes, and Chazal chose the Natilas Yadayim for that. But there's no question that the Natilas Yadayim is an addition to the laws of the Torah. An addition to the laws of the Torah, right? And as I mentioned before, the laws of Muktzah. Somebody I think texted him just now. Muktzah is also a fantastic example. So let's just look at that for a minute. What does it mean, asu siyog la Torah, to make a fence around the Torah? So that the Chachamim had a project of rabbinic law, which was essentially based on a deep understanding of human nature. Right? That human nature, if the Torah tells us don't write, but if you take a pen in your hand and you're playing with a pen while you're talking to somebody, you could come to write without even paying any attention to it. It's a natural human activity. In other words, they understood the human psyche in such a way that if you want people really not to write on Shabbos, you're going to tell them, don't touch the pen. Because the minute you touch it, you might even say that taking the pen in your hand is the psychologically critical moment between not writing and writing. In other words, the writing begins when you take the pen in your hand. The writing doesn't begin when you put pen to paper. Once you've got it in your hand, you've passed the critical moment. In the same way, Chazal, for example, forbade yichud. A man shouldn't be alone in a room together with a closed door with somebody else's wife. Why not? Because closing the door and being alone together is the psychologically critical moment of possibly having intimacy with another woman. And therefore, if you want to prevent the intimacy, it's not good enough just to decide not to be intimate. You've got to decide, I'm not going to be alone with her. And if you make that decision, that's asu siyog late. That's making a fence around the Torah. That not only do you not commit the prohibition, but you don't even get close to it, right? So in actual fact, there is an entire sector of the Shulchan Aruch and of the Gemara and the halachic system which deals with adding bits to the Torah. And yet, in the story of Adam and Chava, we were told that adding bits to the Torah is dangerous. So actually, there is here a much deeper issue. I haven't got the time in the constraints of this shir to deal. It's really a subject for a whole shir, to look very carefully at it and to understand exactly how it's supposed to work. But it's certainly true. Rashi brings down here an absolute truth, that whenever you add to the Torah, you introduce a danger, right, that you could also come to destroy the whole thing. That adding is as bad as subtracting. And indeed, when the Torah gives us the Isser of Bal Tosif and Bal Tigra, Lo Tosifu, Lo Tigra Mimenu, is one of the Tariq mitzvahs, not to add or detract from the Torah. Adding is as bad as detracting. I must just say to you something interesting, which the Rambam writes, which is a little bit controversial. He says, when a person does a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, like, for example, you light the Shabbos candles, or you light the Hanukkah candles, or you do Natilas Yadayim before eating, or something like that, the Rambam says, it's important to know that this is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. It's important to know this is a mitzvah which came to us through the Chachamim, and not a mitzvah min HaTorah. Because if you think, says the Rambam, I must tell you, this is not really applicable to 90% of Klal Yisrael. He says, if you think that the Natilas Yadayim before eating bread is a mitzvah min HaTorah, you have transgressed the prohibition of being mosif ala Torah. You're adding something to the Torah which isn't there. In other words, the Torah wants you to do Natilas Yadayim because it wants you to follow the advice of the Chachamim, but you should know what you're doing. In fact, I'll tell you something very, very interesting, which is in the Yerushalmi. There's a Gemara Yerushalmi, some of you might be familiar with. The Yerushalmi sometimes gives us different halachas to what we are familiar with. And the Yerushalmi takes the view that every time you do a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, like, for example, when you light the Hanukkah candles, so we make the bracha, Asher Kiddushanu, Tozer V'Tzivanu, Lahadlik, right? Hadlik Ner Shel Hanukkah. That's what we make, the bracha. Right? And the truth is, if you think about it carefully, this bracha is very misleading. Because the bracha, we're not addressing the Chachamim, we're addressing God. Baruch Atah Hashem. Elokeinu melech haolam, Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvosav. You've given us a mitzvah. And what's the mitzvah? To light the Hanukkah candles. Is this true? No, it isn't. It isn't true that God told us to light the Hanukkah candles. The Chachamim told us to light the Hanukkah candles, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu told us to follow the Chachamim. And therefore, the Yerushalmi writes, every time you do a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, this is the bracha you make. Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, Asher kiddushanu, b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu, l'shmoya l'kol Chachamim. That's the bracha you make. That's the bracha you make on the Natilas Yadayim. That's the bracha you make on Shabbos candles and on Hanukkah candles. All the brachas that you make on a bracha d'Rabbanan, you make that bracha because that's really what you're doing. You're following the view of the Chachamim. However, the Talmud Bavli disagrees with that and feels that would be confusing and that would maybe lose out on the kedusha of the moment. And there's no question that many people believe that lighting the Shabbos candles is a mitzvah min HaTorah, right? And that is a Torah mitzvah, and it isn't. It's a mitzvah midrabanan, an extremely important one. It's a spiritual one. It's a very important introduction to get us into the mindset of Shabbos, right? But it's not a mitzvah min HaTorah, right? The mitzvah min HaTorah is Kiddush. That is min HaTorah. But lighting the Shabbos candles isn't. But most of us don't know the difference. The truth is that most 90% of the Jewish people, I haven't made a real survey, but this is my guess, 90% of the Jewish people don't know how much of what they're doing is of rabbinic origin or of biblical origin. What is midoraisa midrabanan? And that is right. So somebody asked me on the text, where does it say in the Torah that we've got to listen to the Chachamim? And that is written in Parshas Shoftim, in Sefer Devarim, in Parshas Shoftim. It says, "Lo sosur mikol asher yomu lecha yamin usmo." That the Chachamim will give you instructions, and you mustn't deviate from the words of the Chachamim either to the right or to the left. In other words, the Chachamim in every generation, and particularly the Chachamim of the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, they had the mandate to give us mitzvahs, to give us the wisdom, and that wisdom was based on a deep understanding both of the Torah and of human nature, right? And therefore, we are told, don't just go into Shabbos like that. Take a shower, change into different clothing, put a white tablecloth on, light the candles. All these things are to do with human nature. If you do all that, you'll get yourself into a different frame of mind, and you'll understand that Shabbos is a day of Kedusha. But these were all additions from the Chachamim. The Chachamim came along and gave us this whole layer of legislation on top of the Torah. So we've got a little bit of a dilemma here, which maybe at some later date I'll look into again a bit more profoundly. But it's important to notice that in this pasuk that we're looking at here in the Chumash, right? So Rashi says that when Chava said, don't touch it, you mustn't touch it, that says Rashi, that was the beginning of her downfall. Hosifo ala tzivui. She added to the mitzvah, lefikach ba'alidei giroyan. And because she added, she came to lose the mitzvah. Very, very interesting, this. The later Rashi says, the next Rashi, I haven't brought you all the different Rashis, but here, the next posuk in the Torah says, you're not going to die. So Rashi there says, I didn't bring this Rashi down. Rashi says, what happened? That the Nachash pushed her, and she fell against the tree and touched it, and she didn't die. So the Nachash says, you see, you're not going to die with this tree. So the tree is not dangerous. You thought the tree was dangerous. It was poisonous. You thought the tree was toxic in some way. So why then did HaKadosh Baruch Hu tell you not to eat it? Says the Nachash something incredible. Ki Yodea Elokim. God did not allow you to eat from this tree. Why? Because God knows Ki b'yom achalchem mimenu. That on the day that you eat from it, the nifkechu einechem. It will open your eyes. Open your eyes, meaning, of course, doesn't, of course, mean physically. Pekeach ivrim, it doesn't mean physically. It means you will see new ideas. You will see the world differently. It's an invitation to see the world completely differently. And what will happen? V'yiyu ke'elokim, yod ei tov v'ra. You will become divine beings who know between good and bad. And this is a very fascinating pasuk, because the Nachash is telling us something very interesting, saying eating from the Eitz Hadas will transform your perception of the world and perform your options in life, and you will become a changed person, right? But in order to do that, you have to eat from the forbidden fruit. So eating from the forbidden fruit in some way is seen, the Nachash is telling her, it's going to be fantastic for you. And in some way is also telling her something negative about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's an element of apicorsis here in the Nachash. The Nachash is telling her, you should know that God does not have your best interests in mind. God told you not to eat from this tree, not because he knew it was poisonous, because he knew it was too wonderful. It will give you fantastic gifts. You have a fantastic time. So this is all, I want to get to this next pasuk. So Rashi says, Vayisem ke'elokim, you'll become like God, yotzrei olamos. You will know how to create worlds. This Rashi is very interesting. Maybe we'll come back to it in the next year. I can see the time is really running out. But before we finish, I just want to have a look at the key pasuk here in this whole story, which is as follows. Vateireh ha'isha. This is the moment of the downfall. Vateireh ha'isha. The Isha is Chava, yes, the woman saw, Ki tov ha'etz l'maychal. She saw, exactly what did she see here isn't spelled out here, but she saw that the tree was providing good food. She'd all the time thought that she wasn't allowed to eat from this tree because it was poisonous. Now she saw that the tree, because the Nachash had convinced her that the tree was good. But look at this next phrase is, I think, one of the most fantastic ones. Ta'ava hi le'einayim. Ta'ava hi le'einayim is an amazing, amazing phrase, Rabbi say. Ta'ava, what anybody got any offers the translation for ta'ava le'einayim? How would you translate? It's ta'ava. He translates it as a delight to the eyes, beautiful to behold. But it's much more than that. It's a ta'ava in the scene of it generates a certain ta'ava, a certain desire, triggers a certain desire. And by so we're living in a world in which tens of billions of pounds are spent every year on the advertising industry, and the whole goal of that advertising industry is to make things into a ta'ava le'einayim. You following me? That somebody is selling you just a pair of shoes or an item of clothing or a perfume or a whiskey or a bottle of whatever it is, and what the advertising industry does is transforms it from an ordinary little bottle of something into a ta'ava le'einayim, something which is visually irresistible. Something visually irresistible. I remember hearing once one of the most famous perfume manufacturers in the world. I think it was Chanel or something like that. And they were speaking about the manufacture, the sale of perfume, etc. And they were speaking about how much it costs to make the fragrance and how much it costs to market the fragrance, right? So you will often find that actually the cost of the ingredients of the fragrance is less than the cost of the bottle and the packaging and the advertising. So the actual fragrance costs maybe $5 to make, and the packaging and the advertising and the bottle and everything costs $20 to make, right? So they asked her, why are you doing this? She says, you don't understand. She says, in the factory, I'm manufacturing a fragrance. In the shop, I'm selling a fantasy. And when I heard that line, I thought that was a fantastic line. In the shop, I'm selling a fantasy, right? And that is exactly the idea of ta'ava hi le'einayim. When Chava saw the tree, it was a ta'ava le'einayim. It was something which grasped her fantasy, and as we saw before in the Mefarshim, that the whole idea of the Nachash was that she should suddenly be gripped by this fantasy, right? And you can have somebody selling you a watch, right? And the watch is a good watch and tells the time. In the manufacturing, they manufacture a watch which tells the time. But when they market it, this watch is associated with a racing car and with a jet and with
swimming.
What do you say?
Enlightenment.
Yeah, the advertising industry has made an entire multi-billion industry out of taking simple objects and making them objects of fantasy, because it's the fantasy which gets you to buy it. The fact that you just need to tell the time, you've already got a watch. You don't need another watch, right? You only need one watch. But if you've got a watch which is associated with a certain type of a pilot in a jet or a racing driver in a racing car, and then you suddenly put on that watch and you imagine for 1 second that you're a racing driver. And that's what you're buying. You're buying the fantasy. And the origin of the fantasy comes from this pasuk. Now the Nachash said that this tree, the desire of something, seeing it through the eyes of the fantasy, is something which transforms it into something which it completely isn't. It is nothing like that at all, but that is the power of the human desire. The Nechmod ha'etz lahaskel, we'll look at that a bit more next week. But tikach mipiria, most extraordinary pasuk this. But it just says, but tikach mipiria, she took the forbidden fruit, but tochal, and she ate from it. But titein gamle isha ima vayochel, and she gave it also to her husband, and he also ate from it. It's a very weird pasuk, this really. Right here, she is giving the forbidden fruit to her husband, and the Torah doesn't tell us anything about Adam refusing to eat it or not wanting to eat it or asking her, what are you doing giving me this fruit? Don't you know it's forbidden? She gives it to him and he eats it straight away. What is going on here and how to understand this and what's the significance of this is something maybe we'll look at a bit more Mirz Hashem next week. I can see it's already over time. I hope you're enjoying this insights into Sefer Bereshis, but you've got here some amazing insights into human nature, into the structure of the Torah, and in the Jewish life. I wish you all the very best, and B'ezras Hashem, we'll get back together again in Yerushalayim. Although, so long as we're learning by Zoom, it doesn't really matter whether I'm in Honolulu or whether I'm in Golders Green or around the corner in Yerushalayim. It's the same Torah, and I'm enjoying this shir very much. I hope you